May 1945. Leipzig was no longer a city. It was a carcass. The air smelled of wet plaster and wood ash. The streets were littered with glass that crunched under our shoes like brittle ice. I walked with my hands raised, my heart pounding against my ribs, as American soldiers moved cautiously through the ruins. Their rifles glinted in the pale morning light, their voices sharp and foreign, but their eyes were fixed not on us as individuals, but on the mass of us, women, old men, children, who shuffled forward like ghosts. My name is Clara Weiss. I was 30 years old, once a schoolteacher who filled a classroom with poems and the scratch of chalk against slate. Before the war, my greatest worry was whether my pupils had learned their declensions. By the end, I had no pupils, no classroom, only a notebook tucked against my chest beneath my coat, filled with words I did not want to lose. My husband, drafted in 1942, had disappeared near the Ardennes. Letters stopped coming, and silence became my marriage. I was left alone with my widowed mother until the bombs took her too, and then there was only me. When the surrender came, it was not triumphant or even final. It seeped into us like damp through a wall. One day we still muttered, "Maybe there is hope." The next, the radio fell silent, and the soldiers melted away, and we civilians were left standing in a country that no longer existed. That was when the Americans entered Leipzig, their tanks rolling past toppled statues, their boots scattering pigeons that fed on crumbs in the rubble. A boy near me shouted that they would shoot us all, that we should run. But where could we run? The world itself had become a cage. We were herded into the courtyard of a burned-out government building. The Americans shouted orders, "Hands up! Sit! Quiet!" and German translators repeated them in harsh tones. I obeyed, numb, my legs trembling as I lowered myself to the ground. Around me, women clutched children. Old men leaned on sticks. One girl of perhaps 16 sobbed openly until her mother slapped her to silence. My notebook dug into my ribs, and I pressed it tighter, as though ink and paper could protect me. The hours passed in tense stillness. Soldiers watched us from every corner, rifles ready, their faces unreadable. When food arrived, it was in dented tins of meat, handed out one by one. I held mine in my hands, the metal still warm, and realized I had not eaten properly in days. The stew was greasy and strange, nothing like the potato soups of my childhood, but I devoured it until only the smell remained on my fingers. Hunger has no dignity. That night, we were marched to the edge of the city and loaded into trucks. I climbed aboard with dozens of others, pressed so tightly I could feel every bone in their shoulders. The engine roared, belching fumes that made us cough. Through the slats in the truck bed, I saw Leipzig shrinking behind us, its skyline jagged, its churches hollow. I whispered to myself, "Remember this. Remember every sound, every face. The children who asked for poems will never know this, but I will write it for them, if I live." The camp was ringed with barbed wire, its watchtowers silhouetted against a setting sun. Barracks stretched in rows, wooden planks darkened with rain, their roofs patched with tar. Guards shouted orders in English we could not understand, pointing us toward one hut. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and sweat. Bunks lined the walls, 3 high, straw mattresses crawling with lice. I climbed to the lowest with stiff legs, curling on the straw, my notebook clutched against me like a relic. Around me, people coughed, muttered prayers, argued in hoarse voices. Somewhere in the darkness, a baby cried until its voice broke into silence. Morning came with whistles and boots stomping on the dirt. Roll call. We stumbled into lines, our eyes bleary, our stomachs already clawing for food. An American sergeant shouted. A translator repeated, "You are prisoners. You will work. You will be fed. You must obey." The words rang in my ears. You are prisoners. Until that moment I had thought of myself as a civilian caught in a storm. But now I understood. To them, I was no different than a soldier who had carried a rifle. I was German, and therefore guilty, and therefore a prisoner of war. Work meant hauling buckets of water, scrubbing floors, carrying wood for the kitchens. My hands blistered quickly, the skin splitting and bleeding. Food came twice a day, a ladle of stew or beans, bread so coarse it cut the mouth. Yet compared to the last months in Leipzig, it was almost abundance. Hunger was constant, but death did not arrive as quickly here. Still, I wondered each night if this was to be our life forever. barbed wire, orders shouted in foreign tongues, the endless counting of heads. The irony gnawed at me. For years, our teachers had told us Americans were decadent and weak, too soft to fight. Yet here they were, disciplined, organized, their uniforms clean, their weapons gleaming. They laughed among themselves, smoked cigarettes, tossed sticks of gum to children when officers were not looking. They were not monsters, nor were they saints. They were men, and men carried power over us now. At night, I wrote in my notebook by the dim light of a stub of candle smuggled in from the kitchens. We are shadows now, shadows waiting for someone else's mercy. I do not know what tomorrow brings, but I will remember this. I will remember how it feels to stand in ruins and be counted as nothing. I did not know then that my fate would twist in a way I could never have imagined, that in this same camp, in the shadow of barbed wire, American soldiers would one day do something that shook the very foundation of how I understood enemies and victors. They would invite me, a German prisoner, to sit at their table. If you want to hear how a German woman POW lived to see that impossible moment, subscribe now, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive. The days in the camp fell into a rhythm that felt both endless and unreal, as if time itself had been locked behind the barbed wire with us. At first, every sound jolted me awake at night. The boots of guards crunching on gravel, the clank of a rifle against a fence post, the cries of babies too hungry to sleep. But eventually, those sounds became the music of our captivity, notes in a song of survival that repeated every day. The mornings began with the whistle. Sharp, shrill, it cut through the mist and pulled us out of our straw bunks, our bones aching from the damp. We stumbled outside into lines, blinking in the pale dawn, our bodies stiff and our stomachs gnawing for food. Roll call was brutal in its simplicity. Names shouted, numbers tallied, heads counted. Anyone too slow was yanked forward, shoved to the front, made an example. I learned quickly to stand straight, to move quickly, to keep my eyes down. After roll call came work. I carried buckets of water from the pump until my arms shook. I scrubbed the latrines until my skin burned from the stench. Some days we repaired fences, stacking barbed wire under the eyes of soldiers who joked in English words I could not understand. Other days I was sent to the kitchens, where steam rose in thick clouds from pots large enough to drown in. Pots filled with beans, potatoes, sometimes meat if luck favored us. I stirred the pots with a wooden paddle taller than myself, the smell tormenting me as my stomach growled. The cooks, both German prisoners and American soldiers, laughed at my awkwardness. But when they thought the officers weren't looking, they sometimes tipped a ladle of stew into my bowl, more than the ration allowed. Small mercies were traded in silence, each one a spark of hope. The food was monotonous, but vital. A ladle of beans, a crust of bread, sometimes coffee that tasted of smoke and bitterness. I divided everything with care, giving more to Lotta when she visited me in the kitchens, telling her I wasn't hungry. She pretended to believe me, but her eyes betrayed doubt. Hunger was the common language of the camp, spoken in the way hands trembled when holding a bowl, in the way children licked the insides clean, in the way we dreamed of food at night more often than freedom. The barracks were dark and foul-smelling. Straw mattresses that itched with lice, walls damp with mildew, the air thick with coughs. Typhus spread quickly, dysentery faster. Each week, someone was carried out wrapped in a sheet, the body thin as sticks. The Americans buried them outside the wire with quick prayers, their boots muddy, their helmets tilted low. It was efficient, not cruel, but the ground outside the fence grew crowded with graves marked by wooden crosses. Every time I saw them hammer a cross into the earth, I wondered if my name would one day be carved into one. Despite the misery, I began to notice the Americans in new ways. They were not uniform in spirit, though their clothing and weapons made them appear identical. Some were hard and cold, their eyes like stone, their voices sharp, treating us like cattle to be managed. But others were softer, their gazes lingering with pity, their movements slower, their hands sometimes reaching into pockets to toss sweets toward the children. Once, I saw a soldier kneel and let a German boy touch the barrel of his rifle, explaining in broken German how it worked, smiling as if the war had not placed them on opposite sides. That moment confused me more than any cruelty could. I expected hatred, Kindness was harder to understand. At night, when I returned to the barrack, I wrote in my notebook by the dim light of a stub candle. My words became shorter, sharper, fragments of memory rather than full thoughts. The bread is black, heavy. It tastes of dust. Lotta coughed again, but she smiled when a soldier gave her gum. The fence rattled in the wind like bones. I wanted to record it all, not for myself, but for the children I once taught. If I ever lived to see them again, I wanted them to know that even in the darkest places, words could survive. Rumors drifted through the camp like smoke. Some said the Americans would soon release us. Others whispered we would be sent to work rebuilding France or Belgium, our labor paying for the crimes of our nation. A few swore that the Soviets wanted us transferred east, that we would vanish into mines and forests, never to return. None of us knew the truth, and the uncertainty gnawed at us almost as badly as hunger. Hope rose and fell with every rumor, leaving us exhausted by our own expectations. The hardest part was the shame, not only of defeat, but of being dependent on those we had been taught to despise. I remembered the lessons in school, the speeches on the radio, the posters that showed Americans as soft, greedy, incapable of sacrifice. Yet the men who guarded us bore the marks of sacrifice in their faces. They were lean, tired, sunburned, their boots worn, their eyes lined with sleeplessness. Some were little more than boys, their voices cracking when they shouted, their hands trembling slightly when they smoked. They had crossed oceans, fought battles, lost friends, and still they stood here feeding us, watching us, commanding us. They were not soft. They were not what we had been told. That realization hollowed me out more deeply than hunger. Once, as I carried water from the pump, I stumbled and spilled half my bucket. An American soldier barked something sharp, but instead of striking me, he lifted the bucket himself and carried it back to the kitchens. He set it down with a grunt and gave me a look that was neither friendly nor cruel, just tired. That moment lingered in my mind, the image of an enemy soldier carrying water for me as though we were neighbors instead of prisoner and guard. Another evening, as the sun burned red through the haze, I saw a group of soldiers sitting at a long wooden table outside the mess. They were laughing, passing plates piled with bread and meat, mugs of steaming coffee in their hands. The smell drifted across the yard, rich and intoxicating. I froze, my mouth watering, shame burning my cheeks as I realized how hungrily I was staring. One of the soldiers noticed me. For a heartbeat, I thought he would shout or chase me away. Instead, he raised his mug slightly, as if in a silent toast, then returned to his laughter. It was such a small gesture, yet it set my heart racing. To be acknowledged, even silently, felt like a crack in the wall that separated us. I began to wonder what it might feel like to sit at such a table, to hold a mug of coffee, to eat without fear, to laugh without shame. The thought seemed impossible, absurd. We were prisoners, they were victors. The gulf was unbridgeable. And yet, the seed had been planted. I could not stop thinking about it. One night, as Lotta curled against me, her breath shallow but steady, I whispered to myself, one day we will eat at a table again. One day we will not be shadows. I did not believe it, not fully, but the words felt like a prayer, and prayers, even if unanswered, gave shape to the silence. The weeks blurred into months, and the camp became our world. The seasons turned, frost gathering on the wire, mud thickening the yard, rain dripping through holes in the barrack roof. But beneath it all, beneath the routine and despair, I felt something building. It was not freedom yet, not release, but the sense that the Americans were watching us differently, that something was shifting in their eyes. I did not know then that soon, impossibly, I would be invited beyond the fence that separated our lives, that I would sit at their table, that I would taste their food as if I were not a prisoner, but a guest. And when that moment came, it would shake me more deeply than hunger or shame ever had. Winter had begun to loosen its grip, though the mornings were still cruel, the frost clinging to the barbed wire like tiny knives. Life in the camp had dulled into routine so deeply that I no longer counted days, but only meals. 2 ladles of stew, 1 hunk of bread, sometimes nothing more. Lotta had grown thinner again, though her spirit was stubborn. She scavenged bits of wood for fires, traded buttons for scraps, and smiled whenever she managed to find something that felt like play. I envied her resilience. My own heart had grown heavy, resigned to captivity, even as rumors whispered that release would soon come. It was an ordinary afternoon, one like any other. I had been working in the kitchen, my hands raw from scrubbing pots that seemed larger than my body. The Americans moved around me with the casual confidence of men who were certain the world belonged to them now. They joked with each other, shared cigarettes, leaned against the counters with ease, their laughter rolling like a language of its own. I tried not to listen, but their voices filled the air, reminding me that they lived in a reality just a few feet apart from mine, yet impossibly distant. When the work was done, I lingered near the back door, waiting for the guard to escort me out. That was when it happened. An American sergeant, tall and broad-shouldered, looked at me and said something in English I could not understand. I froze, clutching the rag in my hand. He repeated it, slower this time, and gestured toward a table where several soldiers sat with plates piled high. His hand motioned clearly. Sit. I thought I had misread it. A prisoner did not sit at the table of guards. That was unthinkable. Yet he repeated the gesture, and another soldier younger grinned and pulled out a chair. My legs moved before my mind could stop them. I crossed the few steps, each one heavier than the last, and lowered myself onto the edge of the chair as though the wood might break beneath the weight of my guilt. The table smelled of food so rich it made my stomach twist. There were slices of bread, thick and soft, not the black crust we chewed in the barracks. There were potatoes roasted until their skins split, steaming with butter. And there was meat, real meat, browned and glistening, juices pooling on the plate. My mouth filled with saliva. I kept my eyes down, ashamed of my hunger, terrified this was some kind of cruel trick. But then a plate was pushed toward me. Not scraps, not leftovers. A full plate, the same as theirs. The younger soldier, his cheeks still smooth as a boy's, placed a fork in my hand and said a word I understood without translation. Eat. I hesitated. My body trembled. Every lesson, every warning, every fear told me this was dangerous. Prisoners did not share food with their captors. Prisoners did not cross invisible lines. But then my stomach growled, loud enough that the men laughed, not cruelly but warmly, as if I had joined their circle by that sound alone. I lifted the fork, speared a piece of potato, and placed it in my mouth. The taste was unbearable in its richness. Butter, salt, warmth. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I was no longer a prisoner. I was a schoolteacher again, at a table with colleagues, passing plates, reciting poems. I was a wife again, my husband pouring coffee, my mother slicing bread. I was human again. The soldiers continued their meal, chatting in English I could not follow. One of them poured me coffee from a dented pot, sliding the cup across the table. I wrapped my hands around it, the heat searing my fingers, the smell rising like an offering from another world. I sipped, the bitterness spreading across my tongue, and I almost wept. Coffee had been gone from my life for years, replaced by substitutes of roasted grain or acorns. This was real. This was life itself in liquid form. I dared to glance up. They were watching me, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, perhaps even kindness. The sergeant raised his mug toward me, and I mirrored the gesture awkwardly. The men laughed again, but not at me, more as though they welcomed me into their moment. For the length of that meal, the barbed wire, the guards, the orders, all of it dissolved. There was only a table, food, and the strange miracle of being allowed to share it. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, terrified it would end. When at last my plate was empty, I placed my fork down carefully, my hands trembling. One of the soldiers pushed a piece of bread toward me, and I shook my head, afraid of taking too much. He insisted, nodding firmly, and so I accepted. I tore it in half, saving a piece to hide in my coat for Lotta. When the meal ended, I stood, uncertain if I should thank them, if the words would even matter. My voice caught in my throat, but I managed to whisper, "Danke." The sergeant nodded, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. Then he gestured for the guard to escort me back to the barrack. As I walked across the yard, clutching the hidden bread, my mind reeled. What had just happened? Why had they allowed me, a German prisoner, to sit at their table? Was it pity? Was it curiosity? Or was it something else, something I could not yet name? All I knew was that it had shaken me more deeply than any shouted order or beating could have. It had broken the wall I thought unbreakable. That night, Lotta and I shared the bread. She laughed as she chewed, crumbs falling onto the straw, her eyes bright with joy. "Mama, you ate with them?" she asked, incredulous. I nodded, still unable to believe it myself. "At their table," I whispered, as if saying it too loudly would make it vanish. I wrote in my notebook until the candle burned down to a stub. Today I sat at the table of the enemy. Today they gave me food, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. I do not know why, but I will never forget the taste of that bread or the sound of their laughter. Perhaps humanity survives even in the ruins of war. In the days that followed, I caught the eyes of those soldiers from time to time. They gave no sign of repeating the invitation, but they nodded when they passed, small acknowledgments that something had changed between us. And in my heart, a thought grew dangerous, impossible, yet undeniable. Maybe enemies are not enemies forever. I had no way of knowing that the world beyond the wire was already shifting, that Germany itself was being carved into zones, that new battles of politics and ideology were replacing those of guns and bombs. But in that small corner of captivity, my world shifted with a simple act, sitting at their table. And though I could not yet see the end, I felt it approaching, like the warmth of spring pressing against the cold edges of winter. Freedom would come, and when it did, I would carry with me not only the scars of defeat, but also the memory of that impossible meal. The weeks after that meal passed in a haze of the ordinary, yet nothing felt ordinary to me anymore. I had sat at their table, I had eaten their food. It was as if I had glimpsed another world through a narrow crack in the wall, and though the wall still stood, I could not forget the view beyond it. Each morning the whistle blew, each day we carried out our tasks, each night we returned to our straw bunks. But a part of me carried warmth now, a secret memory tucked against my ribs like the little notebook I never let go of. In March 1946, the Americans began releasing prisoners. Some were transported to work camps in other zones. Others simply walked through the gates with papers in their hands, free to wander back into a land that barely resembled the one they had left. When my name was called at roll one misty morning, I almost did not believe it. The guard handed me a slip, stamped with American lettering, unreadable to me, but heavy with meaning. He pointed to the gate. Just like that, the wire was no longer my horizon. Lotta skipped beside me, her hand gripping mine, her eyes wide with excitement. She had grown so much in captivity, her face thinner but sharper, her eyes older than any child's should be. I looked at her and felt a pang of guilt. She had lived a year behind wire, a year of hunger, a year of watching her mother bow her head to strangers. Yet she smiled now, pointing at the trees beyond the camp, whispering about how green they looked. Children forgive the world so much more easily than adults. The road home, or what remained of home, was long. We walked for days, catching rides in carts when we were lucky, bartering scraps of clothing for food along the way. The land was scarred. Villages were charred skeletons. Bridges lay collapsed in rivers. Fields lay fallow and riddled with bomb craters. Everywhere we went, people moved like shadows, displaced families dragging bundles, old men searching for sons, women searching for bread. It was as if all of Germany was a camp now, fenced not by wire, but by ruin. When we reached Leipzig, I hardly recognized it. The school where I once taught was a shell, its roof gone, its walls scorched black. My mother's house was rubble, a pile of bricks I sifted through with bleeding hands, finding nothing but a bent spoon and a scorched photograph. I stood there with Lotta and felt the weight of emptiness press down on me. Everything I had been before the war was gone. But then Lotta tugged at my sleeve, her eyes bright. "Mama, can we have bread today?" she asked. Bread. Not a home, not a past, just bread. I realized then that survival was enough for now. Life in post-war Germany was a lesson in humility. The occupying forces issued ration cards. We stood in long lines for hours to receive small portions. Flour, potatoes, sometimes dried milk. I mended clothes for neighbors, sewed scraps into dresses, patched holes in boots. Slowly, brick by brick, the city tried to rebuild itself. Rubble was cleared, walls were raised, but the scars were everywhere. Scars in the buildings, scars in our faces, scars in our memories. Yet through it all, I carried the image of that table, the sound of soldiers' laughter, the warmth of coffee in my hands, the weight of bread on a plate. It haunted me not because it was cruel, but because it was kind. That kindness unsettled me more than hunger or captivity ever had. It made me question everything I had been taught about enemies, about victory and defeat, about who we were and who they were. Years later, when Lotta was grown and the world had shifted again, I told her the story often. She would laugh, incredulous, that her mother had once eaten at the table of American soldiers. "What did it taste like, Mama?" she would ask. And I would smile and answer, "It tasted like life returning. It tasted like hope." She carried that story with her, told it to her own children, who listened wide-eyed, chewing their own bread without ever wondering how miraculous it was to have it. When the first cafes reopened in Leipzig in the 1950s, I sat at a small table with friends, sipping coffee that was bitter but real, eating bread that was coarse but warm, and I thought of that camp table. I realized then that the memory was not only about food, it was about dignity. To be invited, even briefly, even by chance, to sit as a guest rather than stand as a prisoner, had restored something inside me that I thought the war had destroyed. The war had taken my husband, my home, my classroom, my mother, but it had not taken my humanity. The Americans, with their strange accents and their easy laughter, had reminded me of that in the simplest way possible, by letting me sit among them, by treating me as if I still belonged to the world of the living. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see the steam rising from the potatoes, feel the heat of the coffee cup in my hands, hear the scrape of forks on plates. I can feel the moment when shame loosened its grip on me, when the enemy became just men sharing a meal. That moment has outlived the rubble, the hunger, the barbed wire. That moment is the one I carry. And so, when my grandchildren ask me what it was like to live through the war, I tell them the truth. I tell them of the bombs, of the hunger, of the fear that never loosened its claws. But I also tell them of that table, of the day the world bent just enough for mercy to slip through. They shake their heads, not understanding how something so small could mean so much. But one day perhaps they will, because history is not only made of battles and treaties. It is made of moments like that, moments when kindness survives against all odds. And those moments, fragile as they are the ones that matter most. If you have followed my story, if you have walked with me from the ruins of Leipzig to the day I sat at the table of American soldiers, then I ask you to keep it alive. Subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every act of remembrance matters, because the smallest mercies of the past are the seeds of our humanity today.